Hello, welcome to the Visual Storytelling Masterclass. I think this should be very fun and interesting. So let's actually get into testing this out and seeing if I can actually explain this. This is something that's very difficult to explain, and I'm not sure if I can do a perfect job. I should be able to do a pretty good job. So let's see how this goes. So the main concepts we will be going over are the mindset of a historian and how that goes. And I'll explain that. I'll get into that. I don't want to spoil it too much yet. Then there's visual tips. So basically like color theory and color harmony. Then there's some extra tips that I don't know if I should have put it in, but I'm going to put it in anyway as sort of like an extra just in case. Very helpful, but not necessarily something I would put in this every time. So the mindset of a historian. Now, if any of you have ever been in a AP World History class for high school, like I was last year, it was very difficult for one, but you learned a lot about actually thinking like a historian because that's what they tested you on. You had to have a problem, and you had to look at what they gave you and try to figure out what it was actually like. And you had to assume certain things, but you were not assuming. You had to take the information they gave you and logically think out, well, if they had money, then they must have spent money. What they spend money on? Food and other things like that. So there's a lot of things that you can keep going down that rabbit hole until you can get, you can figure out more and more and more that has to be true because one thing is true. So this is a very interesting technique or way of building because it's very good for story-driven maps or something when you're trying to communicate an idea. Because when you're trying to communicate an idea with your Minecraft art or any kind of art in general, you have to think through every detail that you're giving the person because a picture says 1,000 words, and as an artist, it's your job to choose those 1,000 words and to figure out the story that you're trying to portray. So that's sort of like the idea that I'm basing this off of here. Now, obviously, you don't have to do this. If you're making a cool image, it doesn't matter at all if you just want it to be cool looking. But if you're trying to make something that actually has a meaning behind it, if you're trying to tell the audience something, it's a good idea to try to think through it and try to think through what you're telling them, how you're telling them it, and how you can make the story make sense. Because if something makes sense and it's easy to understand, it makes it seem like your artwork is easy. Like they could make the artwork themselves. Which it sounds backwards because if you're making something that's supposed to look impressive, then obviously you don't want it to look easy. But sometimes the most difficult artworks to make are the ones that appear to be easy. Those can be so enormously hard because it tricks you into thinking, oh, this is easy. All you got to do is do this, this, and this. I can make something just as good. If you try, you'll find out, wow, there's too much to think about. There's so many things you have to think about to lay them out and to try to figure it out. It's very difficult, especially if you don't understand what the artist was doing. So obviously, develop your own way of doing this. I'm just telling you how I do it, and hopefully it can help you figure out how you can do it yourself. Now, another useful outcome of this is because when you're logically thinking through and developing the story like that, it basically means that the continuity stays the same throughout the story. Basically, even if you just have one image, one building shouldn't have something that is blatantly, obviously not supposed to be there. And I have an example of this, which I'll show in a moment, and how you can go through the story and think through each step and how you can figure out different details that you could add to make it make more sense or to make the story more interesting. Because, artwork doesn't need to make sense, but if you want to develop a story, you can use those tidbits of facts and information and that logic to make the story be a part of the artwork. And when people hear the story, they're like, wow, this makes so much sense. It's so interesting how their society clicks and turns and how the story goes along with their society. So it backs up everything. And this would be really good for writing a book or even cinematography, a bunch of other things. This is not just Minecraft art that we're talking about here. But, this is something that you can definitely use for Minecraft art, especially since you're walking around the world, which there's some techniques that I'll be explaining later on for specifically walking around the world and a couple other things you'll see. So this is the example here. This is something I found off of Pixabay. Most of the stuff I found was off of Pixabay, so I didn't have to deal with copyrights. You're welcome. Yeah, you're welcome, BuildCon. I saved you from copyright strike issues. You're welcome. Anyway, so with this house, this is a fairy house, and this is not a very good example, truthfully, because it wasn't made by me, so I can't really put the examples in it. But basically, I just want something in the background that you could see, because I didn't have enough time to build my own fairy house specifically for this purpose. So basically, a fairy house. So if you were a fairy, obviously you have wings. Now, those wings are very important to you, and you use them all the time to go from plant to plant, to pollinize, to improve the forest, to do what a fairy does. And if you've never noticed, or if you have noticed, fairies fly for a very long time. They pretty much fly all day long. That is a very long time to be flying around the forest. They have a lot of energy that they are using. That is a lot of energy. And you see the neighbor's house over there, that looks like a long way to us, but for a fairy, they fly from tree to tree all day for miles, human miles, not just fairy miles. They fly for human miles. That's a very, very long distance. So for a fairy, it's different. So that house over there, that's easy to fly to. So I'm thinking of a fairy house that's up in a tree. So imagine you have a fairy house up in a tree, and there's neighbors, and these neighbors are in the acorns, and they're right next to each other. Now, why would you need, you would have a small walkway up into the building, but why would you need bridges between the fairy houses? These fairies, they fly. Why do they need a bridge? There's no reason to have a bridge. But what if they did have a bridge? Because that's a common mistake. Because if you're making something for Minecraft, you would probably want to be able to get from house to house. Even if it's a fairy house, you're in survival. You can't fly from house to house. You have to walk there. So in that case, if you're a fairy and you have bridges, that either means that you have people that can't fly, or most likely a fairy wouldn't have other people. But with that bridge, let's say if that's a mechanic of their world, if there's a bridge from house to house and they walk that bridge, why else would there be a bridge? If they can fly, all they need is a landing pad. They just fly over, get on the landing pad, knock on the door. Hello, how are you? Can I borrow some sugar, please? I ran out a while back. I don't have any. I need to make some tea. Something like that. They're going from house to house, looking for a cup of sugar for their cake or tea, all the things that they're making. And if they have a bridge, it just doesn't make sense. Why do they need the bridge? Well, the reason why they need the bridge, if there is a bridge, which in our world there is, that bridge is there because they can't fly. They can't fly all the time. But as we just proved, they have wings. They fly all day. Why don't they have just a landing pad? Why do they have the bridge? Why should there be a bridge? They can fly as much as they want. And think, maybe it uses energy. They fly all day. Why? How would it use so much energy that they couldn't fly a couple feet away to get to their neighbor's house? It wouldn't make a lot of sense. So it can't be muscle. It can't be food energy. Walking can't be easier. Otherwise, they would have walked to all the flowers and flown up. These things don't make a lot of sense when you really think about it. There's certain things that just don't make a lot of sense when you think about it in your head. Now, if to make it make more sense, we can say, there's pixie dust. The pixie dust is what costs. So the reason why they walk to house on those bridges is because they don't have enough pixie dust. They use the pixie dust they need to get from plant to plant to tree to help the forest. After the forest is helped and after everything is done, then they used up almost all their pixie dust and then need to save it. So they walk from house to house instead of using their pixie dust. If they're in a hurry, obviously they'll fly. But for the most part, they have to walk from house to house, walk from place to place, except for when they're on duty, because they have to use the pixie dust to get from the plant to plant, and they use the wings as a helper to help them with their pixie dust. I think this is a good idea, because then, maybe, obviously they don't have unlimited pixie dust. This means that however they're getting the pixie dust, it has to be difficult. And that adds drama. So if you're making a story, that would be a great way to make a story, because you just figured out an issue that they have. They don't have unlimited pixie dust. So the main antagonist is going to have issues getting from place to place. If they're trying to save the world or do other things, they're going to run out of pixie dust sooner or later. And they're going to have that last little bit they're going to have to save. And they're going to go through all these struggles while trying to get to the place they need. And they're going to use that last bit of pixie dust. Then they're going to need more, and they can't find any more. And they're going to have to use their own ingenuity to figure out the end. Yeah, you know what I mean. You could come up with some very interesting stories using these mechanics that you're coming up in the world, because you're just thinking through each process. You're thinking through each process, thinking through every single design to figure out why these fictional characters do what they do. It sounds pointless, but when you actually try it and you're trying to make a roleplay world, if you're trying to make a story, if you're just trying to make an image or a world that feels atmospheric, that feels like it's alive, figuring out these details can give you that little extra bit that can actually knock over your world from being just average or just really, it could be even really amazing. It could just knock it over just that little bit to just get that little bit of an extra cherry on top. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend doing this for everyone. It's not a all-in-one solution for everything, but it can be very, very helpful, and I would recommend people to practice it because it is something that you can learn and develop and do very quickly. I'm a pretty creative person, and I can come up with stories quite quickly. So for me, especially after I've been doing it for a while, like with AP World History, I've got some practice in, so I'm pretty decent at it now. But I would recommend a lot of people to try this out. It's very useful, and I would definitely recommend it. It's a very good technique that I would recommend using, thinking through all those details. As I said, obviously, it's a bit too detailed, and it can take a lot of time, sometimes too much time. So basically, I'd recommend planning to spend a lot of time on a project when you're doing this. Or maybe even doing this while you're building. Like while you're building whatever you're doing and you're building all these houses and they're taking forever and you have a lot of spare time to think about things. Instead of talking about the weather with your friends, you could talk about the storyline that you're trying to create, and you could practice this as you're building. So you can figure out ways of saving time if you're going to try this technique. And I would recommend trying it, seeing if you like it, and if you don't like it, figure out and just make one house. Just make one house and try to over detail it into, not over detail, but over detail the story as much as you want, and just try it out. I think it'd be a lot of fun for you guys to try out, and it's a very interesting technique and something that I would recommend to practice. I've seen other people do this, like for example, Gabombo, really good builder. He does this quite a bit. It's really, really cool, especially when you're in the world. You feel like it's alive because the stories he's telling as you go along, quite interesting. And as I said earlier, you can go extreme or you could not go extreme. I would not recommend going extreme for every build because it takes forever to do anything, but I would definitely recommend trying it out. It's a lot of fun as well. So actually, it'd be a great idea if you're just having some fun with some friends. You can come up with a storyline as you go. You could just have some fun and figure out the storyline with your friends, and that could be an entire day's thing where you could just have fun trying to figure out the story. It can be a very fun and logically stimulating process. So visual tools that you can use. So we have story, color, shape, contrast, variation, grouping, composition, and context. Now, I'm pretty sure I have a slide for each one of these. So story techniques. Besides what I've already told you, there's some other story techniques that you can use to make your story or to make your build more interesting. For example, incomplete action, which I have an example of here. And incomplete action, well actually, let me go over the other ones first. Sorry about that. Okay, so we have structure like character, conceptual contrast, and juxtaposition. They overlap a little bit, so I put them as one. And then also characters, or organics of some sort. Now, I'll leave incomplete action to be one of the last. So with structure like character, whenever you're building a structure, it can be very useful to design the structure as if it's a character. Whenever you're designing a character, let's look at these characters. You're designing the face, not the face, I almost said paste. That's a weird word that I just invented. Anyways, the face, whenever you're designing the face, you're designing it to be, either more masculine or more feminine. You're also designing, the hair color to make it appear to be a certain way, to make it look of like a very specific way. So like having, these angel wings to make them, look more angelic. Obviously this is like Satan, and these are angels, and they're, I guess, smiting him with lightning rods that are also arrows. So arrows covered in lightning rods that are obviously going towards his face. And it looks like he's having a very bad time, which is probably a good thing. So, and then also with this snake, this is another thing, designing characters, you also can design props and other things for them that increase the storyline, that make the storyline even more interesting, that help you understand who he is. Because Lucifer, he's the snake, and that actually adds to the story. It makes you understand it better because you're adding in that detail that makes it seem more, well, first, it just makes it make more sense. You're adding information to help people understand what the building is, what it is, where it came from, what's going on. So this can be very useful. Designing certain things. Also, letters can also be very important. I think it's in there. Nope, it's not. It's in context in the previous one. This is a part of context, but also can be a part of structure and other things like that. So adding in information like this, now you understand this, I'm pretty sure, is Hebrew or Greek. I'd have to zoom in. I can't see at the moment, but it looks like Hebrew. And obviously, since this is Hebrew, that even makes the storyline make even more sense because, Judaism and stuff like that. With this painting, which is a Baroque painting, it would make sense that they would do that. Though this looks completely different. Yeah, you understand the point. Designing a character, you add in a lot of details like this armor. Now it's a warrior. You're adding in these details. Well, whoever made this is adding in these details that help the character make more sense. You're defining it. You're telling the people who's watching it who it is. I mean, this is gold. It's not cheap. That's gold. This is probably some type of steel. That was definitely not cheap. Steel armor, that was not cheap either. There's a lot of really expensive things in this. And this angelic lightning bolts, golden lightning bolt as well. Not just blue, like actual lightning, no, a golden lightning bolt. These little details that are in here, they're very subtle, and you may not even realize it, but subconsciously people see this, and it gives them information about what's going on, and you don't even really even realize it. And you can do the exact same thing with structure as well. Also, incomplete action. That's another thing that's very useful. I guess I'll talk about it now. Basically, you see this guy right here, or this person right here. This person's like right in the middle of striking. They're right in the middle. And the reason why this can be very useful is because you give a position that's in the middle of something, your mind will be able to understand where it came from. It probably came from up here. It's in the middle, and it's going to end like around, well, I guess here, around here somewhere, but it's probably going to be thrown at his face. So it's going to end up right at his face. I mean, you can see that. It's probably going to lean forward. Yeah, pretty much his face is about to get pummeled. And you can see that, and you can see it in your head. Your mind imagines it even more. So whenever you do something that is in an incomplete action, you understand what's going on more because your mind will fill in what happened before and what happened after. This is actually an animation technique, because many times in animation, you actually leave out frames on purpose for the mind to figure out what happened, even though you're not showing it. So yeah, structure like character, incomplete action, conceptual contrast, juxtaposition, that's what we're about to talk about. So, conceptual contrast and juxtaposition. This is a example of, I guess, both, but this is more along the lines of juxtaposition. Juxtaposition basically means contrast, but in an image between two objects that may not necessarily be a color. It could be this is a living thing, and you're contrasting it with something that's fake, even though it's the same thing. This would be more along the lines of juxtaposition, but it's also sort of like conceptual contrast as well, which I'll explain conceptual contrast when I get to it. Here's another juxtaposition one. You're putting something that is contrasting to something else. It can also be with color. Sort of like this is a better example. So you're expecting it to be in black and white, but you get something in color. So it's not necessarily contrasting. I mean, I guess it is, Well, it is, but more along the lines of juxtaposition rather than like actually color, because white and black, that has a massive contrast, but you're expecting this to be in white and black. That's why it's like juxtaposition. And then let me try to figure out, there's also this one over here that could be juxtaposition because it's a tree, but then it's in the shape of a heart and you're not really expecting it. So you're comparing two things together that are not naturally together. There's another example of putting, let's say, if you built medieval castles and you lined them up like suburban houses, and you put like these like boats or like vehicles in front of the houses and made it look like a suburban line of houses, but they looked like castles, that would make no sense and it would look really weird. That's conceptual contrast. And it also can be a little bit of juxtaposition, but it's more along the lines of conceptual contrast because it's putting two concepts that are not alike together to make them make more sense, to make them putting them together. Yeah, hopefully you understand that. Here we go. So color. So we have color, and let's talk about color meaning, color theory, color harmony, contrast, value, tone, hue, and variety. So some of these like are sort of pointless to list, but I listed them anyway just to be a bit of a reminder, because you can have contrast in the value, tone, and hue. And obviously you can have contrast like juxtaposition or conceptual contrast. Contrast is a wide range of things. So color meaning. This is something that I think is quite pointless to actually, think about, because color meaning, there's no actual color meaning really. Basically, color meaning, whenever it comes to different societies, every society pretty much has a different meaning for each color. So it doesn't really make sense that you would put red as a specific color meaning a specific thing. I mean, I guess you can, and it's fine, and it can represent whatever you want it to represent, and people will just have to figure it out, and that's how you should probably do it. Don't try to look up a color meaning. Find a color, and if you feel like it means a certain thing in that image, then make it mean that. If you're trying to figure out the meaning of a color, you shouldn't look up color meaning because, as I said, it's so broad and wide. You're going to be a little bit upset when people don't know what the color means. Like, you're going to ask someone like, hey, what does that red mean on those flowers or whatever? And if it's a rose, they're going to be like, oh, that means love. But in reality, you were thinking them as blood red, which would mean that they're death roses. You know what I mean there. Like, colors mean different things to different people. So trying to figure out the color meaning is very difficult, and I wouldn't recommend doing that. I wouldn't recommend looking it up. It generally does not work. This is not just me. This is advice that I've received from professional artists that I've seen on YouTube and other places, Twitter, all over the place. Pretty much all of them say it. Color meaning is just, it doesn't really have a meaning. It's just so many societies have different meanings for it. It just goes out the window. Like, red means love. It means anger. It means it's a warning. There's so many meanings to it, you can't even keep up. Just in America, there's anger, there's love, there's alarm, there's danger, I'm sure there's more. There's winning something, I think. Yeah, there's just so many. It's hard to keep up. So, as I said, color meaning is not necessarily the best idea to try to think about. Sometimes it can be true, and let me go over 2 examples. Basically, everywhere in the world, there's a yellow sun, which is warm, and orange fire, which is warm. And everywhere in the world, they see blue ocean and blue ice. And ice is cold, and ocean is relatively cold. Depends on where you are. And most of the time, it's cooler. It's not like the hot sun or fire. And, water cools, puts out a fire. So, generally, I can't think of very many places that I would think otherwise. Blue is cold and red is warm. So like a reddish orange, even browns, there's warm grays and stuff like that. There's also cool grays, and pretty much the only thing that there is a meaning to when it comes to color is generally the value, like the temperature value. Even though, blue is actually hotter than, red, it doesn't really matter because it's what we perceive. It's what we perceive, and everywhere around the world, as I said, blue ice. So yeah, that's pretty much the only thing is if a color is warm or cold. That's pretty much the only like thing that you really know is going to be like pretty much almost always true. I can't think of anywhere in the world where it wouldn't be true, but there might be, so you never know. So yeah, that's a good example of color meaning that actually can be true. So if you're trying to make a scene look cold or damp or sad and depressing, you can make it a bit more blue, but obviously make sure there's some orange in there, otherwise it won't make a lot of sense. And that's a good way to contrast it. You can contrast it both with the value and with the coolness value and the heat, cold and hot. Next would be color theory. Color theory isn't actually true in the way that you think. Many people think that color theory is a rule, that orange and blue will always look good together. I mean, in a way, they do, but in a way, they don't. Because the reason, like, pretty much blue and orange will look good together if you do it right. I can't really think of a situation where if you didn't use it right, that's the thing, that's key. If you didn't use it right, like, it would look bad. If you didn't use it right, it would look bad. But if you used it right, it would look good. Because they are complementary and they do work well with each other, for sure. However, there's many situations where these paintings break color theory on purpose. Because when you break color theory on purpose, it makes the painting off balance, which is a good thing. An example of this is in music theory. In music theory, you're supposed to, in music theory, there's notes that go together, just like how there's colors that go together. And these notes, you're recommended to play these notes. However, musicians break that all the time. It's not a rule. It's a concept. These notes go together. But here's the but. You use other notes that don't go with it to make it sound bad on purpose to make it sound good. Because whenever you go off note, it makes it feel off balance. It doesn't really sound bad, it's just off balance and it seems a little bit off kilter. Then you step it back into notes that fit well together, and there's this sort of off kilter balance between notes that go together, notes that don't go together, and it constantly it has this flow to it between these notes that go together and don't go together. And it has this really nice balance to it. And it's the same exact way with a painting. There are colors that go together and there's colors that don't go together, but you should use colors that don't go together in some situations and in many situations actually, because you want it to be a little bit off kilter, because then you can have certain parts of the painting that look a little bit off kilter and it goes to something that makes sense, that's on kilter, and it'll make what is on kilter, what makes sense, make even more sense, and it will amplify what you want to be amplified if you use it right. And I don't even know how to use it perfectly correctly. However, it's something that is very useful, and I recommend people to understand a little bit more, because I've seen that some people get a little bit confused with this, and I'm not necessarily the most experienced artist in the world, but I think this is probably true. It makes sense to me. I'm pretty sure I'm fairly accurate. I might need a few things. I need to work out the kinks on that, but this is I think that is what should be done. You should use colors that don't match on purpose, just to make it match even more. So yeah, let's go to what's next. Color harmony. Color harmony basically is another principle. Basically, if you have two colors that are saturated, they don't really mix well together because they're just too saturated, unless they're very close together, like pink and red, or purple and red, or even blue and red, because you can go from blue, purple to red, stuff like that. So as long as they're really close, you can have saturated colors that sort of fit well together. The thing is that you need a color in common. So basically for blue, you could use purple, and purple would blend with blue, and purple would blend with red, and it would have a common color. Basically, color harmony means that when you have two colors that don't fit together, like on the opposite side, like blue and orange, if you want them to feel like they match better, you could add a color to them to make them match better, which would be basically desaturation or white or gray, basically. So if you make them more gray, it makes them closer together. Basically, it means colors that are close together match better. basically because, well, they're closer together, obviously going to match better because they're similar to each other. So you can make blue and orange look similar to each other by having them a little bit desaturated. That's what the concept is. So in some situations, obviously, you don't want colors to fit well together. Some situations, you do want them to fit well together. And obviously, you want contrast in value, hue, and tone. So yeah. Then also variety is another important concept, which I'll also be covering even more later on. Basically, I'll give you a rough overview right now. Variety basically means that you shouldn't have, make sure, nope, I don't have it there. Variety basically means that you shouldn't have, if you have three colors, let's say if you have red, blue, and green. Is that good color? No, if you have red, pink, and green. No, red, yellow, and green. So I hardly ever use this color combination. It's like a reddish area, you have some green, you have some pink. I think that's, or pink and yellow kind of deal. Yeah, anyway, apparently that's a good color combination. I hardly ever use it. Anyway, so instead of having it where it's 25% red, 25% green, 25% yellow, and 25% pink, you should probably have it more along the lines of like 50%, well, not like 60, 70, like 65% red. And then you should have, 10% green and 5% yellow and 15% pink or whatever. I don't have the percentages memorized, but having something along those lines where you have a dominant color, then you have a secondary color, and then you have, you have a primary color, you have a secondary color, and you have a tertiary color. Tertiary basically just means a third or the smallest color. So you can have big, medium, and small, which is basically what we're talking about with the next part of it, which is be for shapes, which is right here. So yeah, hopefully that makes sense. I'm pretty sure those are colors that go together. I do not have color theory memorized. As I said, generally you just have to figure out what looks best with each other. But I would recommend learning color theory. Maybe a little bit better than I do, but that would be recommended if you had those memorized. I'm pretty sure those are color combinations that work well together. So yeah, let's continue on in a second. So I'm back. Sorry for the small break. I had to take a breather and get some water. And I also, while I was at it, I ended up looking up the color theory thing and color wheel and double checked to make sure I actually got those colors right. And I actually got all of my suggestions right. I was actually correct. Surprising, right? I was supposed to know this stuff. Anyway, thought I was right. I do know I did study it. For some reason, had a little bit of brain fart. Anyway, let's continue on. Hope you are enjoying so far anyway. So, let's see. Let me get the pointer back out. Shape. This is a pretty important part because shapes go right along with color, actually, because they're supposed to have primary, secondary, tertiary. It's actually pronounced tertiary, not tertiary, or tertiary. You'd think it'd be pronounced like that, but it's tertiary. Very odd. I looked it up just to check. Like a couple months ago, I looked it up. I don't know. Some time ago, I looked it up. Super weird pronunciation. Anyway, it means big, medium, and small shapes. This goes along with variation and contrast, and I'll be explaining silhouette in a moment. So basically, we have these two things here. So shapes and color. You should have a big shape, and then you should have quite a few medium shapes, and then quite a few small shapes. But the small shapes are not perfectly sized, same with the medium. Basically, the big shape covers everything that you have. Then the medium shape covers pretty much everything in here, and it even can include some of these small shapes, because if you have a small shaped overlapped a medium shape, and you can't, it's right there, sometimes these small shapes can be the same thing as the medium shape. Well, it can extend off of a medium shape. Anyway, so let's look at this example from The Secrets of Making High Quality Art in Blender and Everywhere. This was done by Gleb Alexandrov, that's his name, and he got some of this from Neil Blevins, a digital artist for Pixar Animation Studios, a really amazing artist, and let's see what he said. So, if your image has a nice distribution of big, primary, medium, secondary, and small, tertiary shapes, the resulting image will tend to be more pleasing to the eye. Basically, he's saying Whenever you're detailing something, don't just put all of your details lined up together. This is actually something I've seen a lot in Minecraft because it's so easy to want to do this. First off, it just looks like a pattern and it just looks bland and simple. It doesn't look like a detail anymore. It looks like a big shape. So these details become one big shape. This means that these details are no longer a detail. They're a big shape by themselves. So basically, if you want to detail something a bit more properly, you can have places where it's randomly detailed, but it's not random. There's groupings of detail. And obviously details have to be a color. This is one reason why there is like the big, medium, and small colors also exist. Now, obviously, sometimes small details can be the same color as big details and stuff like that. And you know what I mean, hopefully. And so obviously, all the details are not going to be the same color. All the medium shapes are not going to be the same color, but the color goes along with it, and it's a very, very similar thing that we're talking about. So don't get them confused. Understand that they're different, but they're very similar. So yeah, this is something that's actually quite interesting because, yeah. Here, let me give you one last example, and then we'll move on to the silhouette. Sorry there, had to take a little bit of a breather again. Okay, so this right here. So if we're looking at this cube right in the center, let's look at this one. If we're looking at this cube right here, do we really need to know what this cube looks like? This is the same cube as this cube up here, or this cube, or that cube, or this cube, and they're right next to each other. We don't need to look at every single cube to understand what each of these look like. However, with this one over here, we have to look at this detail. We look at this one, we look at all these, and then we look at this cluster. Then this one. This one, we look at this side, and we look at that side, and we automatically know it's a square. Same way with a couple of the other things in here. So when we're talking about this, don't just make all of your details just too perfectly lined up. There needs to be some random things in there that are sort of grouped up together. When you group things up together, it makes it look more random, even though they're grouped. So let's continue on. I pressed the wrong button. So this right here goes along with silhouette. Obviously, this is a tree, but it looks like a heart. And this is actually very important, even though it seems overly simple. This is another picture off of Pixabay, by the way, though the other one wasn't. That was from, as I said, Neil Blevins and Gleb Alexandrov. Really cool video. Anyway, you can look it up by checking them, just by searching what I said. Let's see. So this shape right here, obviously it's a heart, but it's a tree. What is it? Well, it's a tree. No, it's a heart. This is where silhouette can get confusing because you'll recognize an object as what the silhouette is. This looks like a heart, even though we know it's actually a tree. So this is something that can be very confusing, and it can mess up artwork because many times you'll accidentally make your silhouette look incorrect, because if something's supposed to look like something, and if it's supposed to have a certain shape, then it should have that shape whenever you look at the silhouette. And this is something they had a problem with a couple movies and stuff like that whenever they're changing it from cartoon or from video game to movie. But anyway, now let's actually talk about contrast a little bit because this is something that's quite interesting, but not necessarily very interesting. Anyway, so contrast can be very important. Now, obviously, there's contrast and variation between a lot of variation, not very much variation, a lot of variation in color, variation in story, variation in composition, variation in organics. So basically, let me explain organic variation, contrast, not variation, but the same way with variation as well. But contrast, there can be contrast and variation, color, contrast and story, contrast and composition, and contrast and organic. Sorry, I messed that up a second ago. So contrast and organic, this is going to be very useful because you can use organics right next to your builds, because then you have structural things right next to an organic thing, and it has contrast between the two because they don't necessarily match all that well together. So it has a bit of a contrast, though you can sort of blend them together to all sorts of different extents. Then also something I actually forgot to mention earlier, I'm so sorry, is that organics are very useful for developing story. We're going all the way back to story. I forgot all this at the beginning. But basically, whenever you make an organic in your build, you can use it to develop your story, because organics are creatures. This is how we imagine stories. We imagine stories in the creature's point of view, not a building's point of view. Though you can do that because a building can be a character. But yeah, characters can be a very powerful way to move a story along because we can imagine ourselves as a character, which makes stories feel a lot more alive. Though, yeah, you can do that even with characters that you didn't make. Like if you're building a city, people may imagine themselves living in the city, and that can be imagining themselves in the position of a character that you didn't even make. So that's where some of the other techniques I mentioned can become useful. And I can't believe I forgot to mention that. That's actually really important. I'm not redoing this though, so we're going to continue on. Let's just hope that most people got to this point, and if you have, great job. Variation and grouping, we already talked about that. Grouping is random-ish. Also talked about that. So shapes and color, already talked about that. So composition, and this is starting to get into the extras a little bit. So composition is something that's very interesting, and there's two different kinds of composition I'm going to be talking about, 3D and 2D. Now obviously 3D composition, there's a lot of things that go along with it. Like, so 2D rules, well, not really rules, but 2D composition, you can have the rule of thirds. Now the rule of thirds can be very useful for 2D because you can line things up that way, and you know what I mean. It's more for something that's 2D in a picture frame. Moving space can actually be 3D-ish, but not really. Basically, moving space is whenever you take a picture of something and something's moving or supposed to be moving, make sure you give it enough room to actually move inside of the frame, not just going off frame, but give it room to go in, to be moving in the frame, so you know what's happening, you know where it's going, basically. It makes it feel more complete, and it's easier to understand what's going on. Next is, let's go to both actually, leading lines. Basically, if you have lines in your build that go from one place to another, it can lead people's eyes to that position, which I'll actually show you that hopefully in a moment if I can remember. Symmetry, that's another thing. People's eyes are led to symmetry. Odds actually can be useful because it can make things feel off balance, which can be a good thing because it makes it feel like it has a better flow, which I actually got from Blender Guru's video. Really, really nice video. But I don't remember which one it was because I watch a lot of his videos. Anyway, patterns can also be useful for having patterns in the floor, color patterns, different kinds of patterns. You can also have something framed, so in your build you can put a frame around it, which is, for example, have you seen the patterns where people do the sky patterns in their builds where there's like a giant spiral thing above their build or around their build? That's an example of a frame, which I've seen. It basically keeps people's eyes inside of the frame, and I wish I had an example. I know of some good examples, but I don't really have them with me at the moment. Now that's framing, and also that can be combined with patterns, so framing and patterns. Diagonals and triangles, that's weird. I'm not going to explain it. Negative space, basically giving your eyes places to rest. That's back with this. Basically, you don't have detail everywhere. You have places where there's pretty much nothing because that lets your eyes rest, and then it gives it time to prepare for a whole lot of detail. So it has contrast between no detail to a lot of detail in your build. So having areas of more detail and less detail, not detail all over. Then next, 3D. This is basically the only thing I could actually come up with that's only for 3D. Which obviously all of these are a little bit different in 3D than whenever you're taking a picture, but they're very similar, and I would put them as both. But this one would be atmospheric overheads. This is only for cinematography and actual 3D things that you're going to be walking around in. And then also next, I'll talk about depth first. And then we'll talk about leading lines and atmospheric overheads. This is what I call it. I don't know an actual name for it. It's just I've never heard anyone else talk about it, and I don't know what else to call it. So that's what I'm going to call it. So depth. This is something I see a lot of people mess up. And let's actually talk about that first. And actually, let's go into the Minecraft world. Let's see. Is there anything else? Context, tiles, visual hook, like writing. Okay, yeah. We have a little bit of extra. Yeah, I'll come back to this later. Once we get past this. So context and titles. So basically, whenever you make a Minecraft world or an artwork of any sort, it's a good idea to title your artwork. Because here's an example. Let's say if you have a woman holding a child, and if you called, like a baby, and if you called it a mother's dream, then you're probably thinking, oh, she just had a child, that's wonderful. But if you called it a mother's nightmare, then you're probably assuming that the child is dead. no matter what the picture actually is. Or maybe it just makes it seem dark, even though it could be a bright picture. And then you could do a different picture where you could call it something else, like Psycho's Paradise. You know what I mean? There's so many things that you could call it that could make it seem so dark, or you can make it seem very happy and light and alive just from the title alone. Titles are important, and it changes the entire viewpoint of your picture that you're making. And sometimes not titling something is just as good as titling something. Let's continue on. Visual hooks. Basically, whenever you make something, it's a good idea to have a visual hook, something that actually hooks people in so that they'll keep looking at your image to make it, more interesting and more detailed. Even if an image isn't detailed and isn't even that great, if your hook is good enough, people will love it, even if it's not a great artwork. So let's actually continue on. Scale or not to scale. Basically, you can make things that are to scale or not to scale. And it's a good idea to choose depending on what your story is about, because sometimes it's a good idea to make buildings that are too small for the player to fit in, but it makes the story make more sense, the artwork, or if you're doing a roleplay world, sometimes it's a good idea to do that for houses that no one's ever going to go inside. That could actually be pretty useful in that case, because sometimes you don't want someone to go in a building. Just make it too small for them to go into, and then they're not even going to try. And it could still make sense. You could have little tiny characters walking around if you have add-ons or something like that. So make little tiny villagers, baby villager houses. There you go. Houses for the baby villagers. And that would actually make more sense. It adds in a lot more life to the build. It makes it seem more living. It makes it seem like a city, even if it's tiny. So it can save you time if you know what you're doing. So another great idea, which I don't see enough people actually doing, is actually make your own concept art. Or you could find one online. But if you find concept art online and you use the concept art heavily, it's probably recommended that you actually share the concept art that you're using. Another thing is, I would recommend just sharing it anyway, because it's actually really cool for people to see where your reference came from, and then to see how completely different it looks by the end. So that's something that can be really cool to show that you looked at these images, but it doesn't look like anything like what you thought it would look like when just looking at those pictures. You'd think it would look the same, but it just doesn't. But then they can see where you got ideas from it. It can be very helpful for people. But then also, let's see, you can make your own concept art. This is another great idea, and I would actually recommend, especially bigger building teams. I haven't seen a lot of big build teams do this, but I'm not entirely sure. I've never seen them post it on Twitter or anything like that, which if you did make your own concept art for a build, I'm pretty sure you would post it. But this is a great idea, because I've seen a lot of building teams, they start building a project and it takes them forever to actually finish. They take months and months, and they're on Java and they have World Edit and they have everything they need to actually make it, and it just takes them forever. Instead of it taking so long, one thing that they could actually do is if they got someone to make a concept art in 3D or make a concept art in 2D and basically just make a basic image. So it gives you all a basic idea of what you want it to look like at the end, so that you can have the best looking render from that angle. But then also, obviously you're making it in Minecraft, so make it look good from every angle. But then when you have that reference photo just from that one angle, or if you did a 3D model in Blender, you could design what you want to say to look like so that it looks cool from every angle. And not just that, you could give people photos or a video or like that's going around the build, and it gives them an idea of what it's supposed to look like so that they don't accidentally make something that needs to be destroyed. So it means that you almost never need to destroy a skyscraper. You pretty much always know what the build is going to look like by the end. So it saves you a lot of time. Because as I said, you don't need to destroy stuff. Not just that, you know where things are going to be. You know how tall the skyscraper needs to be in that area. So you can build it to the height that it's supposed to be, or the tower or the medieval place or whatever. And obviously if it's a professional building team, you don't have to worry about the design, but you could just design the general layout, the general 3D composition in the program, and you could take days planning it out. But when you take those days and those days planning it out, or like a week or two planning it out, it saves you months in the long run, especially when you're doing a massive build that could take like a year. For example, I think Elysium Fire, if you're watching this, please comment or do something. Tell me, do you guys make concept art for your builds? Like, I really want to know. And if you don't, I would recommend it. Get somebody in your team, like pay them something or another, and get them to get a digital art tablet, because that is so useful. Get them a decent computer so that they can run Blender and do concept art in there and in like Krita or Photoshop or something like that, depending on how expensive you want to go. And, create concept art in there. And I would recommend Blender because that's what people use actually for architectural visualization. That's one of the industry, a lot of people in the industry are now using that because of how versatile it is. Give somebody some time, they can make some great concept art. And man, you guys could probably like do a lot more art a lot quicker if you're not already doing that. And if you are, definitely, I want to know. Like, that's something I've been debating about this. I don't have a bet going on it, but I really want to know. And if it is, I'm going to be pretty happy. I'm pretty sure they do that you guys do that. If you're watching, comment, message me on Twitter, do something to that. I want to know. Or if one of you guys know, yeah, I want to know. Anyway, that's pretty much it. Let's go back to the composition. Let's actually get into the worlds. I can show some examples of atmospheric overheads, leading lines, and depth. This is the depth is probably the number one most misunderstood concept in Minecraft, like probably ever. I don't necessarily know 100%. I'm not going to say ever. That'd be a bit of a lie to say, ever. Let me actually put this into Minecraft Bedrock Edition on OBS real quick. Opened up the wrong one. There we go. Let's actually go into the world if I can find it. Here it is. So in this world, I have examples of all three. So it's leading lines, atmospheric overheads, and the other thing as well, which should be pretty good. So let's actually see. Here we go. So atmospheric overheads. I don't know what else to call it because I've never heard anyone else talk about this. But basically what we're talking about is things like this tree. Basically, it's a part of the atmosphere and it's over your head. And the reason why I think this is so important is because the sky is over half of your screen. And I think it's probably a good idea. Let's actually add to this even. If we wanted to extend this, we could literally create like a thing for like, I don't know, flags. We can make a place for flags to hang on these buildings. And that would be a great example for an atmospheric overhead. It would be more information in the sky. Because this is information that we don't necessarily use very often, and we don't necessarily realize that we should probably add. But just adding that right there, it adds more information to the sky. Now, obviously, I probably should have done that, but I didn't have a lot of time for this build. I only had a month, so I didn't add a lot of those into the build. But I did add some because it's so useful. Because whenever you have, like, half of your screen is the sky in Minecraft. When we're looking off in this direction, pretty much half the screen is sky. So adding in something in the sky that's over your head will add more information to the picture or whatever you're making. This can be useful for painting as well. But it's especially useful in Minecraft because there's a lot of areas where you walk under something. That's why I call it atmospheric overhead, because you're walking under it and it adds a lot of atmosphere because you're having to walk through the world, not around it, not, if you know it, you should know what I mean. You're not doing certain things like you're not just staring at it. No, you're walking through the build and you're getting like the coolest angle and the most atmospheric thing. Like this world's not even the most detailed world ever. There's not detail everywhere. There's a lot of areas here where, this is not even textured really, but it feels quite atmospheric because your entire screen is taken up pretty much, especially in this area. Or especially in this area as well, because you see that chain up in the sky, it adds in more information. So from this point of view, this is a good example because for composition, because you have that right there, which is in the screen, and it goes up to this, and those two are linked together, even though you might not know it at the moment, but those two are linked together. So it's sort of like a really interesting thing that's going on. You see that extra bit of information, it leads to things off screen. So it's very, very interesting in my opinion. So it's very useful to have that. Next, as I said, would be leading lines. An example of that would be this right here. This is not the best example, but it's a pretty decent example because from far away, that's like a line and you can see it on there and your eyes travel up this to the castle. Same thing with this. Your eyes could either go to the island
and actually go all the way up here, and your eyes follow the path all the way down. Same with this over here. This could also be a bit of a leading line. It moves your eye towards things there. Same with this, could be a leading line over to this guy, this too, all the way down over there, back up. You know, there's a lot of places for your eyes to actually travel. So yeah, leading lines can be very useful in that sense. Let me clear my notifications real quick. There we go. Let's hope that no one joins me since I think I'm appearing online. Anyway, so let's actually talk about depth. Depth is something that I think a lot of people misunderstand because it was explained in a way. Most people learned depth back whenever they were starting to learn how to build. And I think most of you probably know how depth works because most of you have been building in Minecraft for a pretty long time. So most of you probably understand depth perfectly fine. I'm going to explain it anyway for those of you who don't know what I'm talking about. So let's actually talk about that. So even if you do understand depth, I might be able to explain it in a way that might help you understand it even further. So hopefully, even those of you who are really good builders, hopefully you'll get something out of this as well. So depth is something that a lot of people misunderstand because whenever you look at a building like this, I've had someone actually say that this building doesn't have enough depth. I didn't add enough depth. Because, for example, this wall right here, technically, has between about 1.5 blocks of depth. Well, this is not 1.5. This is like let's see, 1 square root of 2, like 1.3. I don't remember exactly, but yeah, like 1.33 blocks or whatever of depth. So yeah, this is under 2 blocks of depth. And right here, this is basically 0 blocks of depth. So it goes between 1.33 blocks of depth to like 0. So yeah, this has almost no depth on it. And then even this is like half a block of depth right there. So hopefully you understand that, like in this case, this structure right here almost has no depth to it. Like this right here, this is probably the area that has most depth, is that spot right there. That's 3 blocks technically. Or that right there, I guess. But then that's like going down too far, so that doesn't necessarily count. So that right there, or this right here, or that, this almost has no depth whatsoever. I mean, like 1 block, I don't even know. That's basically no depth. The reason why it looks good is because it's big enough that I'm not thinking about the depth of the actual structure. I'm not thinking about the depth of this. Well, I guess in this case I was right here. But I'm not thinking of the depth of like that. I'm thinking about the depth between, if I'm looking at it from this position right here, I'm thinking about the depth between this building to this building. So basically, in this case, I have so much depth that it takes up like you have to add an entire building to add depth. So for this building, it's not 3 blocks of depth, it's more like 15 blocks of depth. And that's one reason why this feels so like interesting sometimes when you look at it from certain angles, because this right here, this adds depth to it because you're looking at it from that point to that point. Now, a good way of thinking of this is that Minecraft is art. And you don't need to think about, like, for example, when you draw a picture and when you're explaining depth in a picture, you're explaining, let's actually take an example. Like, imagine if something was a drawing in Minecraft. If this was a drawing in Minecraft right here, you would be explaining the depth between, not the depth of that structure over there, not the depth of that structure. No, you'd be explaining the depth between this bush here, the foreground, to the midground, to over there to some more background stuff. So there's 1, 2, 3, let's say 4 right there, then 5 right there, then 6, then 7. This has 7 layers of depth that goes on for from 0 blocks from this bush right here all the way to so far away it's out of render distance. So let's see how many chunks is that? How many chunks is that? Let's actually double check this. Let's see how many chunks. That's 48 chunks. So in this case, if from this point right here, we have 48 chunks of depth. But most people don't think about depth in that way. They don't think about it as if you're drawing an image. Most people think about depth as in this building right here only has a block of depth, which is right there. Or this building only has a block of depth again. When in reality, there's more kinds of depth than just structural depth. There's different kinds. So it can range between in fact, this is depth too. This sticks out, and there's depth between this here to that there. But let's actually explain the different kinds of depth. Basically, there's the kind of depth that's in a picture or an image for a drawing, or in a 3D world. It's the same way between, because it's basically a constant, a number of photos, basically constant photos. But in structures, there's depth between, like, on the structure. So basically, this does count as depth between this, the point between this and that over there, which this is like, that's quite a bit more actually than a block, I think. I'm not entirely sure. That's quite a bit of depth there. More than a block, but less than 2, I think. I don't know. So yeah, in that case, that's depth there. But then also this is depth. This structure right here sticking off of the house, that is depth. Then the depth of the block sticking out of the house, that's also depth. Then if we go over here, there's the depth between this stone to that tree to that house, to then the background to that right there, then to the background way off in the distance. So yeah, there's different kinds of depth, and in fact, it could keep going on and on and on. We could have bigger and bigger depth and bigger detail, because it can get bigger and bigger. So then we have the depth between this city. This is one thing now. It's not that it doesn't even matter about the little tiny bits of depth. We have the depth between this house, this organic, that castle in the background. So then this technically has less depth because we have less objects in there. Even though there's this castle, it's not up to scale to this organic over here. We have to make this island one entire thing. So yeah, depth is a bit finicky, and it's something that a lot of people, whenever you look it up on YouTube, it's one of the, well, not look it up, but it's one of the first tips that you learn in Minecraft is adding 3 blocks of depth to a structure. The reason why they explained it is because they're not wrong. They just explained it that way as a shortcut so that you'll understand it better in the future, but not necessarily understand it perfectly right now. So obviously don't complain. Like if you are new to building and you feel like these YouTubers that explain something to you and you think that I explained it the right way or something like that, I don't know. If you want to complain to a YouTuber that they're not explaining it correctly, don't, because they are explaining it correctly. Because they're explaining it in a way that will make sense to get you started. So yeah, don't complain about to people that they explained it correctly, because they're not. They're just explaining it in a way that will help you more later than instantaneously. Well, instantaneously help you now, so that you're basically going around the learning curve so that you'll come back to it later when you're ready for it. So it's actually very useful to explain things like that. And if I was making the video, I would probably have to explain things like that as well. Obviously, this video is a bit more of an advanced video, so I get to explain it, which is really, really nice. So that's actually I'm pretty sure that's it. I'm not entirely sure what else I could explain. As I said, like, organics are very useful. I'd recommend learning how to do some organics. They can be very good to explain story. And I have a story for this, sort of how I explained the fairy thing, but it's sort of in the mindset of a historian. However, one thing you shouldn't do, in some cases, not always, but basically the meaning behind this, I wanted there to be a meaning, and I'm hoping people will understand it slightly. But I also don't want them to understand it, because many times people will give themselves, whenever you make an artwork, people will come up to you and say the weirdest thing to you, and say, like, they think they know what the artwork is about, and they'll say, oh, I can't believe this, or whatever, or I can't believe you put that in an artwork. And you're like, yep, I totally did on purpose. In reality, you didn't. But don't tell them otherwise, because then it ruins the painting. I'm sure there's many paintings that are like really famous for having deep meanings. I bet you the artist didn't even make the meaning. I bet you someone else saw it and was like, oh wow, I see the meaning of this. In reality, the artist had their own completely different meaning. It doesn't matter what the artist thought about their artwork. It doesn't matter what you want people to get out of it, because when people see it, like, you can lead them in the right direction, but you can't force them to read exactly the way you read. That's why, you know, in English class, when you're trying to figure out the theme of a story, there's pretty much no wrong theme, is because there isn't. It's the same way with this. You know, creating artwork, as I said, like an image. You know, there's 1,000 words in an image. Yeah, wait. A picture says 1,000 words, and as an artist, it's your job to choose those 1,000 words and to make that story. So it's the same way with any sort of artwork, and the same way with writing. You know, you choose those words, and you have your own theme, but you can't, as I said, you can't really expect other people to understand your theme. You can make it blatantly obvious, but generally it's better if you don't, because then people can figure it out on their own and come up with better things than what you could have ever come up with, if you know what I mean. And generally people end up giving better advice. Like, they'll get advice from your artwork and you're like, I don't even know where you got it, but I'm glad you saw something other. I don't know where you got that from, but if you saw that here and it helps you, then great. Obviously that's that's a bit extreme, the way I'm explaining this, but I hope you understood it. That was a bit extreme, so I'm sorry about that, but yeah, hopefully you understood that. Anyway, so yeah, don't necessarily explain the meaning behind your artwork or whatever, if you do have like a meaning behind it. This has a story and a meaning, so it has a story and it has a theme, has a little bit of both. So yeah, you can explain the story, but I wouldn't recommend necessarily explaining the theme. If you have a theme, or even if you don't have a theme, don't tell people you don't have a theme either, because they might figure something out that's really cool, like a really cool theme of your build that you're like, oh wow, it's really cool. And then you're like, oh, I should have thought of that. And then you can take credit for it because it's your artwork. Apparently they got it from you and they'll give you credit for it. Anyway, sorry. Anyway, that's all. I'm joking, for the most part. So anyway, that's pretty much it. I can't really think of anything else that I've forgotten. I probably forgot a few things, but that's fine. I hope that you really enjoyed this. And anyway, I hope you enjoyed this masterclass. So if you have any questions or comments, definitely comment, in the YouTube video, or you could comment by messaging me on Twitter. Yeah, I'm MrJay, MrJay, with a bunch of numbers on the end that you won't remember, so never mind about that. We'll see if he remembers to put my Twitter in the description, or if I remember. If I don't, then just comment and I'll try to remember to check it out. Anyway, hope you have a great day, and I guess I'll see you later. God bless.